There are few more notorious names in English history, and few who are more mysterious or disputed. In the 5 centuries since her death, Anne Boleyn has been celebrated and damned. Her every action has been interpreted and reinterpreted. Was she a martyr, a schemer, or a victim?
Homewrecker, trollop, you would not believe the things that they love to call Anne Boleyn.
For many hundred years later, she was this devil woman who bewitched Henry and made him deviate from the true religion.
We have to take some of that reputation with a bit of a pinch of salt.
Her sister Mary is more elusive still. Where remembered by history at all, she is often dismissed as a fool, a slut, a disappointment.
I think her reputation as an infamous whore has been overstated.
She wasn't at all. Many girls had much more affairs than she did.
How much choice she had in becoming the mistress is not clear.
The reality of both women, human and flawed as they were, has frequently been lost.
There's something about both Anne and Mary that really resonates with people. We're still talking about them now, some 500 years later.
The sisters had a very complex relationship. It was neither hostile nor was it loving. It was a mixture of the two.
They lived in the court of a dangerous and powerful man, where there were unparalleled opportunities to rise, but where a single misstep could cost them their reputation, their family's fortune, and even their lives. This is a story of ambition and power, of desire and obsession, of a man who could take whatever he wanted, and 2 sisters who faced the consequences. Notorious though the women may still be, remarkably little is known for certain about much of their lives. What they looked like is disputed. The most famous portrait of Anne Boleyn was not painted in her lifetime, and the only image we have of Mary is now thought to be of someone else, perhaps even Anne. Nor is it certain when exactly the sisters were born.
Depressingly, it tended to be the births of male heirs that were well recorded. Girls were largely forgotten as a result.
If they'd been from a royal family, then they would have had their births recorded. The Boleyns were important, but in the grand scheme of things, they were quite a modest, moderate family, and it just wasn't considered important to write down the birthplaces and dates of these 2 girls.
Mary Boleyn is assumed to be the eldest because of various different pieces of evidence, none of which are absolutely conclusive. But probably the most compelling is that when her sister Anne was later granted a title, she's referred to simply as one of the daughters of Thomas Boleyn. If Anne had been the eldest, they would have said that in the grant.
The sisters were both probably born at Blickling Hall near Norwich, a few years either side of 1500. But much of their adolescence was spent in Kent. Hever Castle was the Boleyn family country estate. It was inherited by Mary and Anne's father Thomas in 1505. Thomas Boleyn was an ambitious courtier and diplomat. A gifted linguist, he ensured an excellent education for all his children, including his daughters.
If you had girls, you could just educate them to be wives, future mothers, so needlework, things like that, things that were considered useful for women. But if you were from a wealthier family, you'd teach them how to speak Latin, perhaps. Arithmetic would be important, so they would have had a good upbringing.
It was evident from quite early on that Anne was the precocious one. She's often referred to as being a very forward child, very intelligent, so it's clear that of the 2 sisters, she enjoys the greater intellect.
In around 1513, the adolescent Anne was sent to Europe. Her father had secured her a place at the court of the Archduchess Margaret of Austria. It was a coup for Anne and the Boleyns. The court was regarded as the foremost finishing school for young ladies in Europe.
Going to Margaret of Austria's court, I can't begin to describe what a big deal this was. It's like if you were a stage mom and you have the opportunity to put one of your children in a Steven Spielberg movie. It's like giving her that opportunity.
Margaret of Austria's court was known for being sort of quite flamboyant and artistic, and Margaret of Austria herself is supposed to have been a very kind and generous woman, and there is some evidence that she was actually very personally attached to Anne.
She immediately took to Anne. She recognised a kindred spirit. And what better education for the young Anne Boleyn than to be raised in one of the most cultured and civilised courts in the world?
Poor old Mary Boleyn was left behind doing her embroidery and seen pretty much as second best.
It would have been natural for Mary to resent her precocious younger sister. Mary's chance would come. In 1514, both Mary and Anne were chosen to serve as ladies-in-waiting to Henry VIII's younger sister, who was set to marry the King of France. Anne, however, was still at Margaret of Austria's court, so Mary went alone. The marriage was not a success. Louis XII died less than 3 months after the wedding. The crown passed to Louis's cousin, Francois. Soon afterwards, Anne joined her sister at the new French court. But the Boleyn girls would have very different experiences there.
At this point, you really start to see Anne and Mary's lives diverge. That Mary is the much more home-loving one. She doesn't really quite catch on to the quick, barbed intrigues of court life. That Anne just relishes the joust. She relishes the fight.
Claude of France let all the other ladies go back, but she offered to let Anne stay in court with her. This is a French queen, very cultured, very educated, very well-respected, but she wanted Anne.
Anne's life became very much based in France. For a good number of years, she kept those French affectations for the rest of her life.
Anne remained exposed to this highly artistic, cultivated Renaissance court. And she was certainly exposed to some very powerful women, the Queen Mother of France, Louise of Savoy, for one, and would have been able to see how women of influence and power were able to operate for themselves. And I think that time was incredibly formative in terms of the woman that she would become.
Anne would remain in France for 7 years. Mary had a less successful time at the French court. The new king was a notorious womanizer. It seems Mary was among his conquests, and word got out.
Mary soon caught the attention of Francois, who was very, very similar to Henry VIII, really. His mirror image in France. Loved ladies, loved the finer things in life. And of course, Mary Boleyn was a famed beauty, so she soon caught his attention.
Mary disappeared from recorded history for the next 5 years. She was not at the French or English court. Some have speculated that she was sent away to a noble house in France. There, out of sight, her reputation could mend, and Mary could be schooled in the conduct expected of her. All we know for certain is that on the 4th of February 1520, Mary was in England, for that was the day she got married. King Henry VIII attended their wedding. Perhaps that was where Mary caught his eye, for soon afterwards, he began an affair with her.
Mary's affair with Henry VIII is fascinating because there is strong evidence to suggest that, in fact, she wasn't entirely complicit in this, and that Henry manoeuvred her into such a position that actually she was obliged to become his mistress.
He usually waited until a woman was married to seduce her, and any children that she had would have been claimed as the husband's. That was just the way things were done then.
There are lots of contradictions at the court of Henry VIII when it comes to love affairs. So, on the one hand, everything is governed by a very strict moral and chivalric code. It's all very romantic, but then beneath that, of course, it's a court full of ambitious young men, beautiful ladies. There are liaisons going on all over the place. And so the reality is a good deal less moral than Henry would like to project in public.
A woman at court is in a very difficult position, particularly when the king importunes you. What are you going to do? Say no? He might banish you, he might banish your husband. He has all the power, and you don't have any at all.
In 1522, relations between England and France soured. Anne was summoned home to King Henry's court. Once again, she soon outshone her older sister. Even while Mary was the king's mistress and possibly had a child by him, she was overlooked by most at court. Anne was the star.
Anne stood out from other women in the English court because of that French influence, because of how long she'd spent there.
She's had an excellent education in France and also with Margaret of Austria. Now it's her time to shine in England.
There's always been people, male and female, who have what was called the 1920s it. There's just something about them that's extra charismatic. And Anne had that coming out of her pores.
It is not known when Henry ended his affair with Mary. By 1526, however, it was certainly over, as he had found a new love. It was, of course, Anne Boleyn. In the 1520s, the lives of the Boleyn sisters revolved around Henry VIII. The elder, Mary, had a secret affair with the king and may even have borne him a child. In the middle of the decade, it was Anne who captured the king's desire. Her hold over him would last far longer and would have far greater consequences.
The affair between Mary and Henry began to fizzle out. It was partly because he always lost interest in his affairs, and he found her accommodating and very sweet, but not particularly interesting enough to catch him.
The popular misconception about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is that it was love at first sight. In fact, it takes Henry about 4 years to notice her. So it's in around 1526 that Anne seems to have finally caught the king's attention, and he makes a declaration of love for her. He makes no secret of her. Once he's fallen for Anne, then he falls big style. He is absolutely obsessed with her.
It could have been a week between him getting rid of one sister and moving on to the next. There could have been that crossover, could have been a couple of months. It would be tempting to think there was at least a little bit of crossover, because the more time he spends with Mary, the more likely Anne Boleyn is to be nearby.
Henry courted Anne in style. He showered her with gifts, he wrote these effusive love letters, he visited her, he really besieged her, tried to make her his mistress. But of course, Anne famously refused.
Anne kept the king at arm's length. She retreated to the family estate of Hever Castle, where she remained for 2 years. Her absence from court has been debated by historians for decades. Was it a scheme to heighten the king's desire, or was it a genuine attempt to end his obsession?
She packed up her stuff, she headed back to Hever, she stayed with her mom. That's not playing hard to get, that is hard to get. The last thing that's going to happen is a courtier from the 1500s being able to tell Henry VIII, back off.
I think, unlike her sister, Anne never allowed her heart to rule her head. She kept a certain degree of shrewd political acumen, but she had seen her sister set aside, and she believed, I think, that she had a purpose and a destiny. And I think ultimately, Henry, being the alpha male of England, found that incredibly alluring and only incited him to pursue her more.
By 1527, King Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, could no longer bear children. Their 18-year marriage had produced just one surviving child, their daughter, Princess Mary. Henry was desperate for a son to continue the Tudor line. He became convinced that God himself was denying him. Catherine, after all, had once been married to his late brother. She insisted her first marriage was never consummated, but Henry would not be deterred.
Catherine won't have her marriage declared illegitimate, and so she was living in sin. That would also make her daughter a bastard and remove her from the line of succession. And there is this battle of wills.
We should be in no doubt that if Catherine had had a living son, none of this would have happened. Actually, they had a happy marriage for 20 years.
Instead of doing what he really should have done, finding another foreign princess to create a union with, instead, he let Anne gain this utter ascendancy over his heart, and he was determined to get her.
The thing is, once he was getting a divorce and he made it clear he wanted to marry her, there was no one else in that kingdom she could marry. There was no one that was going to risk his wrath to marry her. So her options were to become a nun or marry him.
Securing an annulment would not be easy. Henry entrusted the matter to his chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Over the next 5 years, lawyers and churchmen across Europe would grapple with the matter. As they did, the Boleyns grew more and more powerful.
Of course, to a family, a daughter's virtue is the most important thing. But if they think they can push their daughter in the way of the king and get some kind of power, influence, position, lands out of it, then they will. And so the Boleyns saw that they could get power out of Anne. They could use Anne as a conduit to the king.
But sickness nearly derailed everything. In the summer of 1528, there was an outbreak of the deadly sweating sickness. Anne herself fell ill with the disease, which could kill in hours. Much to the king's relief, she survived. The Boleyn family were not left unscathed. On the 22nd of June, the disease took Mary's husband, William Carey.
She was left with 2 young children to care for, and it's clear that she was, if not destitute, poor. And she was on the fringe, really, of her family.
It was thanks to Anne's intervention, in fact, that Mary was granted an annuity of £100.
Anne also took over the ward of her young son, Henry Carey. So that meant that, of course, Henry was no longer a financial burden upon Mary, and clearly Anne was there to step in and help out her sister. And there does seem to have been some bond of affection, sisterly affection between them, certainly at that time, although that would change.
The widowed Mary left court and returned to Hever Castle. Once again, she disappeared from recorded history for several years. Anne and the rest of her family had greater concerns. Little progress was being made in the annulment between Henry and Catherine.
Henry, being Henry, assumed that he would be able to get that dispensation from the Pope in Rome quite quickly, within a matter of months. However, of course, that didn't happen.
He was not prepared for this. Anne wasn't prepared for this. No one was prepared for how hard it would be.
Henry's in this impossible position. Catherine won't go. She won't retire. She won't say her marriage was consummated with Arthur. The Pope is backing her up. So is the Holy Roman Emperor. There doesn't seem to be any way of doing it, but he has to do it.
Rumours of the king's affair with Mary Boleyn were also spreading. They exposed the hypocrisy of Henry's case. For if Catherine's relationship with his brother made their marriage incestuous, then surely Henry's affair with Mary ruled out any connection to Anne. The ongoing failure to secure the annulment infuriated the king. He searched for somebody to blame.
Wolsey, of course, was an extremely powerful man at court for many years, the right-hand man of the king. He played an important part in trying to get the annulment of Henry's marriage from Catherine. However, he failed repeatedly, and I think Anne began to blame him for not pursuing the annulment as vigorously as she thought he might.
That was strike one for the cardinal. The second part was that he started to negotiate with Europe, and it was widely agreed that if Henry cast Anne aside, it would be much easier to negotiate. When Anne found out, she was horribly offended. She was absolutely furious, and she refused to have anything to do with Wolsey. And she essentially said to Henry, you know, you have to sort this out. She wouldn't stand for it.
Wolsey was a brilliant statesman, very shrewd, but he miscalculated. He thought Anne was just another of Henry's short-lived love interests and that she would soon be out of court. Of course, that was a grave miscalculation, and he paid the price.
Wolsey was banished from London. He was accused of treason and ordered to return only to face the charges. He died on the journey. With Wolsey dead, Anne grew more powerful, and she gained a new ally in the figure of Thomas Cromwell. He shared Anne's sympathies for reforming the church and, with her support, soon had the king's ear. He tried a different approach to Wolsey, and King Henry would be declared supreme head of the English church. Nobody would then be able to deny him. Anne's years of waiting were nearly over. In 1531, Henry dismissed his wife from court. He would never see her again. Anne was queen in all but name. Early in 1533, Henry and Anne were finally married.
Henry and Anne's wedding was so secret that we can't be absolutely sure when it took place. It was probably the 25th of January 1533 at Whitehall.
At the time, the king was still married to Catherine of Aragon, so technically he was a bigamist at this point.
There would have been only a handful of witnesses. It would have been a very low-key affair. And in the end, it was rushed through, and for good reason, because Anne was already pregnant.
Henry had banished his wife of 2 decades. He had broken with the Roman Catholic Church, and he had enraged half the country. All for Anne. All for the son she would give him. It was Anne's greatest triumph. Her family were the most influential in the land. Even Mary, still secluded at Hever Castle, would rise alongside her sister. Victory seemed total. But this Boleyn supremacy would prove short-lived. In 1533, the long years of waiting were over. Parliament passed laws to strip the Catholic Church of its authority in England. Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, finally forced through the annulment of the king's first marriage. And Anne and Henry were finally wed. All was set. That June, the pregnant Anne Boleyn was at last crowned Queen of England.
Anne Boleyn's coronation was an extraordinarily lavish affair, the like of which had never been seen in England. Henry went to great expense. There were pageants and celebrations across the capital.
There was a procession of barges down the river. The celebrations went on for 4 days. Thousands of people turned out to watch the spectacle. There was feasting. She was carried in a litter through streets and people were performing plays. So it was 4 days of festivities, all for her. So it must have felt like she was the second most important person in the world.
She'd done what no other woman had ever done before. She grabbed the king for herself. And most of all, she was really the true wife of the king. He was in love with her. It wasn't an arranged marriage that he'd done for dynastic purposes. He was utterly in love with her. And so she was now the queen.
The public despised Anne Boleyn. She had very few supporters. They saw her as usurping the rightful queen, Catherine of Aragon, who was greatly beloved of the people.
Anne's widowed sister Mary returned to court. She was appointed as one of the new Queen's ladies-in-waiting, but again, her time at a royal court proved an unhappy one. As she wrote later in a letter, "I saw that all the world did set so little by me." She bore the brunt of her sister's unpopularity and was keenly aware of it. All were convinced that the new Queen would grant Henry what he desired most. In September 1533, Anne went into labour and gave birth to a baby girl.
The birth of Elizabeth was a catastrophe. Yes, she was healthy. Yes, she was strong. But she was a girl. He'd been convinced it was a boy, and to him, it was an omen.
It made a mockery of everything he had gone through to marry Anne and to set aside his first wife, because the only reason that Anne would have been accepted by the population of England would have been if she'd given birth to a prince, an heir.
The minute that that baby was declared a female, that was the beginning of the end.
The birth of another unwanted girl only deepened the growing unhappiness in Anne and Henry's marriage. Their long courtship had perhaps set impossible expectations on both sides. Henry blamed Anne for the failure to provide him a son, and Anne struggled with the change from mistress to wife.
Anne was an incredibly intelligent woman, much cleverer than the king, and so she wanted to help him rule. But what she found was that Henry expected certain things of a queen.
She wasn't cut out to be the wife of the king. Now, Henry was used to a wife who was compliant, she knew her duties, to be very much in the background. That wasn't Anne's style at all. She wasn't prepared to turn a blind eye to his indiscretions, and when she knew that he was starting to pay attention to other ladies, she was furious and she upbraided him in front of his courtiers, which he hated.
A woman who was very religious, who had refused to become the king's mistress no matter what, that's when you get all the stories of Anne's bad temper. Well, how she didn't just start stabbing Henry, I don't know.
Despite their quarrels, Anne soon fell pregnant again. In 1534, she had almost reached full term when she had a miscarriage. She lost the baby. It was a boy.
Her second pregnancy, she flaunted it, of course. She was very confident. She famously talked about her cravings and really showed off the fact that she was expecting again.
Anne lost that child very late into that pregnancy, possibly into about the 7th or 8th month, which would have been an extremely traumatic event for her. Henry seems to have been absolutely beside himself. That was clearly a very emotionally destructive event for the two of them.
Anne fell pregnant again quite quickly, but we start to see the same pattern as we see with Catherine of Aragon. Failed pregnancies, miscarriages, simply pregnancies that will not go to term. And every time pregnancy fails, Henry loves Anne a little less.
Anne had lost a child and was losing Henry. The sadness and anger she felt were heightened by the actions of her sister. In the late summer of 1534, just weeks after Anne's miscarriage, Mary reappeared at court. She was clearly pregnant. In secret, Mary had remarried. Her new husband was a man named William Stafford, a man with no title or fortune to speak of. Something shocking and incomprehensible had happened. Mary had married for love.
Women have no right to marry for love. They marry for security, they marry for money, they marry for their family's prospects. That's what they're there for.
In those days, you certainly had to ask your father for permission. And when your sister is the Queen of England, you certainly have to ask her. And Mary didn't do either of these things, probably because she knew that she would be turned down. The person she chose, just a lowly soldier. He had no social standing. He certainly wasn't good enough for a sister of the Queen.
It's at precisely this moment when Anne is really struggling to give Henry a son, or indeed just another living child, that her sister Mary arrives at court. She's newly married and she's pregnant. One can't help but suspect she's showing off, really.
Anne and the rest of the family were furious with Mary. She was banished from court. There would be no allowance to support her this time. The two sisters would never meet again.
Mary was very shocked at the severity of her sister's reaction and indeed the king's reaction. And she was probably quite hurt and a little bit panic-stricken because I think she just accepted it as a given that as the new queen's sister, her place at court was assured.
In a letter to Cromwell, Mary wrote, "Good Master Secretary, sue for us to the King's Highness, and beseech His Highness, whichever was wont to take pity, to have pity on us."
Why did she write to Cromwell? Well, he is the most powerful man in England next to the king. He's the new chief minister, really, of Henry VIII. And it's thanks to Cromwell, I think, that Anne Boleyn is on the throne. He, in the end, had arranged that annulment, had put Anne on the throne. So, of course, Mary is pleading to Cromwell to help her, but I'm afraid her pleas fall on deaf ears.
By now, the wily Cromwell was no friend to Anne. He may have helped her become queen, but the pair clashed repeatedly. After England's break with Rome, a wealthy prize was up for grabs, the lands and property of the monastic orders. But Anne and Cromwell disagreed on how to spend the money.
Thomas Cromwell sent his hit squads all over England looking at how much money the monasteries had. And Anne felt that the money of the monasteries, if it was taken from them, should be used for good works and creating educational opportunities given to charity. Cromwell felt very clearly they should be given to the royal coffers to give Henry a boost.
She didn't want the dissolution of the monasteries. She thought that, and that may actually be what killed her.
Anne had her preacher preach a sermon, which drew parallels between how Cromwell was dealing with the dissolution of the monasteries and pocketing some of the money, perhaps not for himself, perhaps not into worthy causes. And I think Cromwell found this sermon very threatening and began to think, this is you or me, and it was a matter of survival.
Anne was standing between Thomas Cromwell and money. That turned out to be not a good place to stand.
Anne made a great mistake in making this powerful enemy in Thomas Cromwell, because if he wanted to bring her down, he could.
It was Cromwell who would engineer Anne's fall. When it came, it was sudden and dramatic. Within weeks of celebrating the death of Catherine of Aragon in early 1536, Anne had yet another miscarriage. It was her last chance. Just months later, Anne was arrested on charges of treason. On the 2nd of May, 1536, she was taken to the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn's fall was as sudden as it was brutal. Henry VIII had pursued her obsessively for nearly a decade. Now, just 3 years after becoming queen, Anne faced trial and execution.
Anne was now in an incredibly vulnerable position. Henry clearly was losing interest in Anne. He'd also lost faith in her, I think. So she hadn't delivered the son that he desired. His eyes had fallen upon a new lady at court, Jane Seymour.
Jane Seymour was the opposite of Anne. She was sweet, she was gentle, she was retiring, and Henry became obsessed by the fact that he must marry Jane and have a son with her.
There was one man who had the power and cunning to dispatch a queen. After all, he had done it once already.
I think most historians now agree that Thomas Cromwell really was the person who thought up and conspired the plot against Anne.
Now, Thomas Cromwell knows an annulment won't work this time round. He has to get rid of Anne permanently, and so he devises this gossip.
He managed to secure confessions of ladies of Anne's chamber who placed accusations towards the Queen about her impropriety with other gentlemen of the King's chamber.
Anne was accused of adultery with not just one, but 5 men, including her own brother George. Now, it's no coincidence that every single one of those 5 men were enemies of Thomas Cromwell. He's killing 2 birds with the same stone.
By claiming incest, it made Henry look less bad. If she just committed adultery with one man, maybe it was because Henry was failing her. But if she was so lascivious and disgusting that she would sleep even with her brother, well, that's clearly not Henry's fault. That's clearly something wrong with her. So he went to Henry, whispered his little poison in Henry's ear, and then Henry became, as far as anybody can tell, sincerely convinced that Anne Boleyn must have been sleeping with 100 men. When she would have had time to do this while surrounded by a billion other people and not even sleeping alone in the same room? Magic, I assume.
For the crimes of adultery, incest, and treason, there could be only one punishment. Anne was arrested on the 2nd of May. 5 men, including Anne's brother George, joined her in the Tower of London.
When she arrived at the Tower, she knew she was never going back. It was not going to be a fair trial.
In those first few days, she seems to have undergone some kind of breakdown. She was distraught. There was a lot of incoherent ramblings as she mused on what must have been brought against her. Cromwell, of course, made good use of that.
During Anne's imprisonment in the Tower, she'd become almost hysterical at one point, famously putting her hands around her neck and saying, you know, I have a little neck, the execution won't take long. But towards the very end, her bravery shone through.
The first trials were held on the 12th of May. 3 courtiers and a musician were accused of adultery with the Queen. All 4 were found guilty and condemned to death. 3 days later, Anne and her brother were put on trial. The indictment accused Anne of despising her marriage and entertaining malice against the king, and following daily her frail and carnal lust. Anne was faced with a jury of peers, presided over by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. But by now, she was beyond the help of her family.
In a Tudor court, once somebody had been accused of a crime, then they were assumed to be guilty of that crime, unless they could prove themselves innocent.
Gotta remember, the only man to confess sleeping with Anne was the only man low-born enough to have been legally tortured. There's no proof he was tortured, but he's still the only guy that confessed. Men that could not legally be tortured, every single one of them went to their grave saying they were innocent.
It was a ragbag of gossip and tittle-tattle woven together, which fabricated the case against her.
It was not going to be a fair trial. It was a done deal. She was going to be found guilty of adultery with all these men, and so as a consequence, they and she were going to be publicly executed.
On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed.
Henry gave her one act of mercy, which was that rather than an axe, he called for a French swordsman to come over, especially from France, and cut off her head in one little chop.
Beheading by the sword was much swifter, much cleaner than by the axe. So it was one last favour that Henry showed towards Anne.
Then she knelt in the straw, arranged her skirts behind her. And it is said at some point that she turned briefly to the swordsman, and at that point he called out for the boy to get the sword from beneath the straw. And as she looked round in the direction of that voice, the swordsman struck with one clean stroke, and her neck was taken from her body.
Only days before the execution, Henry had his marriage to Anne annulled by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate.
He was making absolutely sure of it. It wasn't enough to have her executed for adultery. He had to have the marriage dissolved too.
He needed to clear the path to any offspring that he would have with Jane Seymour. He did so according to the fact that he had had previous relationships with Anne's sister Mary. This brought the 3 of them into the first degree of affinity, which was against kind of moral and church law, and meant that any union which Anne and Henry had entered into could not be a valid one, and that was grounds to declare the marriage null and void.
After her execution, Anne was buried in the chapel of the Tower of London. Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days later. She, at last, would give him the son he had so longed for. Edward was born the following October. Jane died soon after the birth, and despite marrying 3 more times, Henry would have no more children. He died in 1547. Anne's sister Mary lived in obscurity for the rest of her life. There is no proof Mary ever reconciled with what was left of her family. After her father died in 1539, Mary inherited the Boleyn estate and became a wealthy woman.
We don't even know if she was in London or in court. There is no record of what she thought about the demise of her sister or her brother, unfortunately.
Her family had been publicly shamed and the terrible aspersions had been cast on them. It was very clear to her that there would be no place for her in the future of court, in the future of aristocratic life in Britain.
She goes into obscurity. We don't know much about her life thereafter, and that may have been deliberate. She knew when to keep a low profile.
Mary has often been seen as rather lacking in intelligence, the stupidest Boleyn. But even though the Boleyns were disgraced and suffered a lot, and both her brother and sister were executed, she stayed out of it and was not dragged into the case or the trial or the execution. So perhaps in the end, she's rather cleverer than we gave her credit for.
Mary died on the 19th of July, 1543. Her resting place, as with so many details of Mary's life, is unknown. She died of natural causes in a loving marriage and fine home, which is more than can be said for her sister. Anne and Mary's offspring would shape British history for centuries. Mary's children became knights and courtiers, and one of her descendants now sits on the throne of England. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was restored to the succession. She went on to become one of the greatest monarchs in British history. In their own times, few valued the Boleyn sisters beyond their potential to catch a powerful man's eye, to give him pleasure, or grant him a son.
I think the legacy of both of them is the fact we're still talking about them now, some 500 years later.
Anne Boleyn was a force of nature. She was a woman ahead of her time in so many ways. And she was such a pivotal, an important part of the Reformation that she really changed the landscape.
Mary, by contrast, was far more conventional. She was a well-to-do lady who became a royal mistress and then led a comfortable life thereafter.
It is a crying shame that both of those women are still slut-shamed for things that were beyond their control. So I think their legacy is tarnished, and it shouldn't be. Their legacy should be that they were strong. They did the best they could with what they had, and then they were punished for being too good at it.
They have a legacy of their own, in their actions and identities as individuals, as women, as sisters.
On June 12, 1942, a young girl received a diary for her 13th birthday. The gift was given during one of the most turbulent and bloody chapters in modern history. Just a decade before, a terrifying force had been unleashed in Germany. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, took power and began to systematically persecute the German Jewish population.
It was really very scary to go out in the street to do your shopping, and many, many people disappeared. Many, many were arrested.
Forced emigration, imprisonment, and murder were becoming daily threats for Jews. And as World War II broke out and Hitler gained more and more territory in Europe, those Jews who fled persecution found themselves under threat once again, unable to escape.
After several weeks and months, the measures against the Jewish population started to bite.
She was not allowed to go into parks, she was not allowed to go to the movies, she was not allowed to use public transport, which was a very visible measure also in terms of the persecution of the Jews.
The girl in receipt of the diary was Anne Frank, a young German Jew who had fled with her family from Frankfurt in 1933, but now found herself trapped in occupied Amsterdam.
For some, she is a victim. For some, she is a source of inspiration. For some, she is a brilliant writer.
As she put pen to paper to record her experience, she could never have envisaged that it would lead to one of the most well-known works of literature the world has ever seen.
People said, well, who is interested in a diary of a young girl?
Nor could she have realized that it would also be the document to a harrowing and ultimately tragic story of persecution inflicted on a child who had become the symbol of millions of others.
It's a remarkable fact that a book has been able to inspire so many people in so many different ways.
Through her, of course, the world is learning about what has happened.
The story of Eva Schloss, also an emigrant to Amsterdam, would run in parallel to that of Anne Frank. She could not have imagined, however, how inextricably their lives would be linked.
One day a little girl came to me and introduced herself, and she said it was Anne Frank.
Separately, Eva and Anne would spend 2 years hiding from the constant threat of the Nazis. These two young girls would share similar experiences, but their lives would have very different outcomes.
There are 1.5 million children murdered, but if you talk about that, people can't imagine. So Anne has become a symbol for all those 1.5 million victims.
Eva survived to tell her story, but the legacy Anne Frank left would end up having a global impact.
In the Holocaust, Anne has become the most important victim, actually.
Anne was born to a German Jewish family. Her father's family had lived in Frankfurt for 7 generations. They were very culturalized. They were very settled in Frankfurt. Her mother was Edith Hollander, also from a Jewish family. Anne's father was Otto Frank, 7th generation German Jew, who had actually fought in the First World War and been decorated with the Iron Cross. 3 years before Anne was born, her sister Margot was born. Anne was born on the 12th of June, 1929. She was a pretty normal girl growing up in a German family. The lives were very much like kids live their lives today, playing in the street, going to birthday parties, a very normal childhood.
In 1933, the Nazi Party seized power in Germany. Hitler's anti-Semitism meant that Jewish persecution was implemented immediately, and the very normal childhood experience by Anne and thousands of other Jewish children in Germany would be changed forever.
She came with a family to the Netherlands in the beginning of 1934.
The Nuremberg laws were introduced, and life became increasingly difficult for German Jewish families.
All books of Jewish authors are ordered burned in the public squares. Authors, scientists, artists are driven from Germany. 1,600 have fled to Holland, 12,000 to France, 1,200 to Spain, 3,000 to Czechoslovakia.
The Franks chose to move to Holland, and in 1934 arrived in Amsterdam.
Otto knew people in the city and went originally himself to see if he could find work, start a business, which he did.
Anne and Margot both enrolled in Dutch schools and both seemed to adapt well to life in Amsterdam.
Basically, she was raised as a Dutch girl in the 30s, went to school. She was fond of reading. She read a lot of books.
She was actually quite precocious, though, for a 13-year-old, and quite self-absorbed. She was the chatterbox in the class and always getting into trouble with the teacher.
The family quickly settled into their new surroundings. The Netherlands became their home, and a normal life could once again be resumed. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler made several territory gains in Europe, one being the Anschluss in Austria in 1938. Eva Schloss, a child living in Vienna at the time, found herself having to move.
I was born in Vienna in 1929, and I had an older brother who was 3 years older than me. We were a very happy family there, and all this ended up abruptly when the Nazis came in, and we were lucky enough to be able to get out in time.
They first fled to Belgium before finally settling in Amsterdam, another Jewish family fleeing from persecution.
Amsterdam was a lovely city. The people were very welcoming to refugees. I went back to school, I got a bicycle, we were together again as a family, and it looked as if life was going to get back to some kind of normality.
The years in Amsterdam before 1940 were very peaceful, very normal, and they felt that they had found a haven of safety from the Nazis.
We moved onto the Merwedeplein, a modern square in Amsterdam. Well, it was actually more a triangle where apartments were on both sides, and there was a big open space where all the local children came to play after school. And one day a little girl came to me and introduced herself, and she said it was Anne Frank. We were 11 when we met. I was more a tomboy. I liked to play with the boys and as well tricks on the bicycle. And Anne was more a sophisticated little girl, interested in her clothes, in hairstyles, in film stars, and as well in boys already. She said her family comes from Germany, and I couldn't speak much Dutch yet, so she took me up to her apartment and I met her family.
During this meeting between Eva and Anne on the square of the Merwedeplein, neither would be able to comprehend how their lives were going to be intertwined and their idyllic life in Amsterdam would soon be turned upside down.
They chose Amsterdam because in the First World War, Holland was neutral, and they felt that there would be a refuge for Jewish people in Holland.
Unfortunately, in May 1940, the Germans invaded that country as well.
Towns and villages were in flames as the invaders rolled on at a breathless pace, encircling the defenders and slashing their armies, destroying in the name of the new order the homes and shops of those who had dared to resist. The Nazi machine broke the back of Dutch resistance in 4 days.
After the occupation of the Netherlands in May 1940, life seemed to stay pretty normal and pretty much the same as before.
Life continued, but I must say we were afraid what would happen. And after several weeks and months, the measures against the Jewish population started to bite.
Jews not wanted. Jews keep out. Even in parks, if Jews are allowed at all, special yellow benches are set apart, labeled for Jews.
She was not allowed to go into parks, she was not allowed to go to the movies, she was not allowed to use public transport.
Not theater, swimming pools, those were things which upset us children. And then we had to leave our school, and we had to wear a yellow star.
Which was a very visible measure also in terms of the persecution of the Jews.
And then they started to arrest people, especially young people, male. So it was really very scary to go even out in the street to do your shopping or anything like that. And many, many people disappeared. In 1941, many were arrested.
The turmoil and persecution faced by the Jews in Amsterdam was beginning to become unbearable, but it would be a letter sent to all Jewish youths which would decide the fates of both Anne and Eva.
After 2 years, In July 1942, about 10,000 young people got a call-up notice to be deported to Germany to work in German factories. My brother Heinz, who was 16 at the time, and Anne's sister Margot, and many, many others of their friends got this call-up notice. Many parents sent their young people, but they didn't end up in Germany in working in factories. They were sent to Mauthausen and just murdered there. So it was very, very difficult, but nothing, of course, what was going to follow up.
What came next would see tragedy beyond compare for Ava and Anne. Both their lives would play out to the backdrop of war and mass genocide. The takeover of Germany by the Nazi regime in 1933 and the subsequent occupation of the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia caused much of the Jewish population to emigrate to avoid persecution. The Netherlands was one of many countries that took in Jews from persecuted areas of Europe, and both the families of Anne Frank and subsequently Ava Schloss would establish their home there. Unlike World War I, where they remained neutral, Holland would find itself in Nazi-occupied territory in 1940, and once again the Jews who had fled persecution found themselves the persecuted. Life for both Ava and Anne would become increasingly hard, but it would be a letter sent to their older siblings which would have irreversible consequences.
That was the time that my father and Otto Frank and many other parents decided they wouldn't send their children, but we would go into hiding.
Well, they tried to leave the impression that they had to leave for Switzerland, where the family of Anne's father lived.
Otto decided, because where he worked was a warehouse with rooms above.
The annex to the house was pretty much unused, so it was an empty space. These annexes, they are a common feature in Amsterdam.
There were lots of sort of staircases and rooms at the back that could be easily obscured. So he started making plans in 1942 that should there be an eventuality, the family would go into hiding. Now, it came more suddenly than he had anticipated.
After Ava's brother had received his letter, Ava's father, like Otto Frank, would decide that hiding would be the only option. Without having prepared a hiding place, Ava's family would have to seek an alternative method which would see her family divided.
We had to split up. Nobody wanted to take a family of 4. So I went with my mother, and my father and brother went to a different hiding place.
Anne Frank and her family entered the hiding place at 263 Prinsengracht on July 6, 1942. A few weeks later, the Van Pels moved in. Herman Van Pels was Otto Frank's business partner. His wife August and their son Peter all joined the Franks in the annex. The last person to enter the annex was Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist from Berlin who emigrated to the Netherlands after the Kristallnacht in 1938.
So you imagine there were, in these limited number of rooms, there were 8 people in hiding.
I think Anne's relationship with these people is very much influenced by the fact that she was 13, 14 years old. She was a young teenage girl, and with a very lively character, she really felt trapped.
I was more an outdoor child, so I found it very, very difficult to sit still day in, day out. Missed my father and my brother and my friends.
So I think the strive for freedom is very much dominant in the diary.
The living conditions in the secret annex were extremely cramped. Anne, having been forced to share a room with Fritz Pfeffer, who in the diary she refers to as Dr. Dussel, would find solace in her writing. Her writing was partly an act of catharsis, as with many teenagers, but it was also spurred on by a radio broadcast that she happened to hear on the BBC World Service.
There was radio broadcast because you were not allowed to listen to the BBC, but people did. Somebody from the Interior Minister, I believe it was, said everybody who can should write a diary about what happened to them during this occupation. It's very important for the future.
The first entries in the hiding place reflect a sort of sense of adventure and excitement. However, the boredom and tedium soon set in, followed by the fear as they heard the bombing raids.
When you read the diary, you read all about all these scenes and all her emotions when it comes to her relation with the other people. She loved her father, she had kind of a difficult relationship with her mother. Her relationship with her sister, Margot, was on and off.
During the course of those 2 years, she also falls in love with Peter, the boy in the secret annex. However, towards the end of the diary, she's outgrown him, and she's concentrating more on her personal philosophy, how difficult it is to have those ideals when everything around her is crumbling.
The Germans made house searches in the apartments because they really wanted to catch every Jew. So we had a hiding place within the hiding place. The people from the resistance came and built hiding places where we could go when they came at night to search for us.
Otto had secured a loyal group of his workforce to aid the Franks in hiding. They were Miep Gies, the office administrator, Jo Kleiman and Victor Kugler, the office managers, and Otto's secretary, Beb Voskiel.
Well, the 4 employees of Otto Frank enabled them to stay here for 25 months. They provided them with food, with drinks, with books, very important for Anne.
To look after 8 people for over 2 years was an incredible burden of responsibility.
They made a choice to risk their own lives in order to save that of others.
Throughout their time in the annex, the 8 of them would often tune in to radio broadcasts to listen to the progress of the war. They were heartened to learn that on June 6, 1944, the Allied forces had landed in Normandy. More than 800,000 Allied troops entered occupied France by the end of June, which along with the Russian forces to the east would create a two-front war for the Nazis. This was the beginning of the end of World War II. The invasion was a great source of motivation to Anne and all those in hiding. They could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Otto would listen for news of the advancement and plot it on a small map of Normandy hung on the wall of the annex. Ava, however, would not hear of the Normandy landings and Allied advancement, as she and her mother Elfriede, along with her father and her brother Heinz, had been betrayed and captured in May 1944.
After 2 years, we were betrayed by a Dutch nurse who pretended she was a member of the resistance, but she was really working with the Nazis.
Unlike Ava Schloss and her family, it would be and continue to be to this day a complete mystery as to the identity of the person who betrayed the Frank family.
It was a telephone call in the morning of August the 4th, 1944. What they say, that it was a woman's voice which said that there were Jews hidden in 263 Prinsengracht.
The Franks, the Van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer were all getting along with their restricted daily routine when the Dutch police and a Gestapo officer, Karl Silverbauer, entered the office and asked the staff at gunpoint to open the bookcase. They knew from the anonymous tip-off exactly what was going on in the building. They went up to the annex and all were arrested, including 2 of their helpers, Jo Kleiman and Victor Kugler. Miep Gies had managed to evade arrest. She knew that the authorities would soon be coming to clear the annex, so managed to rescue what she could. It was then she found Anne's diary. Knowing that Anne was a budding writer, she placed it safely in her desk drawer. It was there the diary remained, lying dormant, waiting to be reunited with its owner. Ava's capture had happened on May 11, 1944, her 15th birthday. They were settling down to breakfast when there was a knock at the door. The Gestapo barged in and arrested Ava and her mother and took them to the Gestapo headquarters.
We were first sent to Westerbork, which was a holding camp, and we were immediately put on a list and transported to Auschwitz.
It was in Auschwitz where Ava and her family would be kept for the duration of the war. After their capture in June, the Frank family would follow Ava's route to Westerbork work camp in the Netherlands and then east to Auschwitz.
Anne and Margot were transported to Bergen-Belsen. There was no food, it was pretty much abandoned. It was riddled with disease, so you imagine the combination of despair, of cold, of starvation and disease. It was pretty impossible to survive Bergen-Belsen.
Anne and Margot's health deteriorated rapidly in Bergen-Belsen. In March 1945, a typhus epidemic swept through the camp, and although there are no records, it is this which is believed to have killed firstly Margot Frank and then 2 days later, Anne Frank. The real tragedy lies in that just a few weeks later, Bergen-Belsen would be liberated by British forces.
Despite German attempts to cover up, we found these in the open field. Clear-cut evidence of beatings and outright murder was on every hand. Nameless victims were numbered for records which the Germans destroyed. This was Bergen-Belsen.
Ava and her mother Elfriede, along with Otto Frank, all of whom were still in Auschwitz, would each find themselves seeing out the final days and felt the relief as the Russian troops liberated the camp. All 3 would not foresee at that time how inexplicably their lives would become linked, not to just each other, but to Anne Frank and the legacy she would leave. The lives and experience of Anne Frank and Ava Schloss had mirrored one another throughout the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Both had been forced to hide, and both had been betrayed, captured, and sent to concentration camps. This is where the similarities end, however, as Anne Frank, along with her sister Margot, tragically perished in Bergen-Belsen just weeks before the liberation. Despite the death of her father, Erich, and brother, Heinz, Ava and her mother both managed to survive the horrors of Auschwitz along with Otto Frank, Anne's father. As the Allied troops advanced from the west and from the east, World War II drew to a close.
We were liberated by the Russians in 27th of January 1945. And Otto Frank was liberated with us in Auschwitz, and he did the same journey as we did. We saw him several times, but there were several hundred of people.
It took him 5 months to get back to Amsterdam.
And the Germans were fighting very, very hard in Poland. So the Russians took us away from Auschwitz, and the only way we could travel was eastward, always in cattle trucks, till we ended up in Odessa. And there we waited for the end of the war. And we were, of course, very anxious to get back to Amsterdam. And in Odessa, we waited for a troop transport ship to come, which came eventually, and then we went to Marseille, and then all the way up through France to Belgium, and eventually back into Amsterdam. So from end of January till June, we were all the time traveling, really.
Otto knew that his wife Edith had passed away, but he still believed there was some hope for his 2 daughters, Anne and Margot.
But he didn't know about his 2 girls. So he always said he had great hope that they would be alive. And we, of course, as well, my father and brother.
Ava, her mother, Otto Frank, and hundreds of others would sail from Odessa in the Ukraine to Marseille in southern France. From Marseille, they traveled north back to Amsterdam. They arrived in Amsterdam in June 1945, 6 months after they were liberated from Auschwitz. The Amsterdam they came back to was not the same place they had left the previous year. The threat of the Nazis was no longer there, but their occupation had taken its toll.
It had suffered a lot, of course. The last year was the hunger winter, because the Germans took everything the Dutch produced to feed their own people. And many, many thousands of Dutch people perished from starvation. So we were not well received, actually. Not because they didn't want us to come back, but because they had suffered and they didn't really know what to do with more people who needed help.
Returning to Amsterdam, Otto Frank found that his family home in the Maveda plan was no longer available.
He couldn't move back in his own apartment because other people had moved in.
He had nowhere to go. Survivors came back. It was like arriving here from another planet.
So Otto moved in with Miep Gies, who was one of the helpers. It was still around the corner from the Maveda plan.
Eva and her mother, however, found that their apartment was still there for them to move into.
We were lucky we were able to get into our own apartment, because when we came to Amsterdam, it was a furnished apartment belonging to a Christian, and she gave it back to us. And we waited for news of our family.
Finding refuge with Miep Gies, Otto Frank was still unaware of the fate of his daughters. The thought of being reunited with them kept his hopes alive.
So he went to the central station every day where people arrived from wherever they had been and whatever camp they had been, in order to look for them, in order to know about their fates or about their whereabouts.
And he came to visit everybody who was connected with Anne or Margot, and to try to find out if they knew anything. There were lists of people who were in different camps.
He appealed in a newspaper for news of his daughters, and we still have that advertisement. And then he was introduced to two women who were in Bergen-Belsen, in the same barrack as the Frank girls.
Otto Frank came to tell us as well that he had heard that both his girls had perished in Bergen-Belsen.
Eva and her mother had also been living in hope that Eric and Heinz would be found, but they would receive the same news as Otto.
In July, we got a notification from the Red Cross that both my father and brother had perished in Mauthausen, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp.
Edith Frank, having witnessed her children being taken away from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, died in the January of 1945. Both Anne and Margot were to die within days of each other, with Anne having to witness her older sister's death. From the 8 people who were in hiding in the annex of 263 Prinsengracht, only one survived. That was Otto Frank.
When he came first to tell us that the girls had died, he looked as if he couldn't carry on with his life.
He went back to tell Miep, and Miep went to the drawer where she'd been keeping Anne's diary, and she said to him, "Here you are, Mr. Frank. Here is the legacy of your daughter."
She went into the secret annex after those who were in hiding were captured and taken away from here, and she managed to save lots of the diary papers.
Miep knew that within a couple of days everything would be taken away.
She kept them with her until after the war, and when she learned that Anne would not return, she gave these papers, notebooks, sheets to Anne's father.
Miep hadn't read it. It was Anne's private diary. Otto went into another room and quietly read it. He came out ashen-faced and said, I never knew my daughter.
Otto and Elfrida would begin to see more of each other, offering support from their shared experiences and losses. One of the first people to hear Otto read extracts from Anne's diary was Eva.
A few days later, he came with the diary and opened the packet very carefully, and he read a few sentences, but he always burst into tears. He couldn't read it in one go, and it took him 3 weeks to read it. He told us that.
He agonized for a long time as to whether he should publish it. She wanted to be a writer, she wanted to be a published writer. But at the end of the day, it was a private diary. And she said things that were maybe not suitable for other people to read. She wasn't very nice about her mother.
Everybody told him he should publish it, and especially a history professor told him he has to publish it, it's his duty.
Otto was paying more and more visits to Eva and her mother. During these encounters, Eva would start to witness Otto's philosophy, which would be the driving force for his life's work.
And Otto came very often. My mother cooked him a meal. He was very lonely. We talked a lot, and he told me that he, who had lost everybody really, he had no hatred. He said, you know, if you hate, you'll be so miserable.
Otto Frank dedicated the rest of his life to the diary of Anne. I think what is remarkable was that he managed to do so in a very special way, not just being that a memory of what had happened and how his family had suffered, but very much as a message to young generations to build a new future.
Otto would find that global recognition would initially come from America. Firstly with a hit Broadway stage show, and then an Academy Award-winning film. Obsessions of Anne's which would seem fitting for her legacy. Otto Frank had lost everything. The hope he carried with him as he made the epic journey back to Amsterdam was soon evaporated when he heard the devastating news of the death of both his daughters, Anne and Margot. At the same time, Otto was given the diary which Miep Gies had kept. Eva Schloss with her mother would witness firsthand the rise of what would become one of the world's most regarded works of literature, one of the world's most tragic stories, and the creation of a symbol of hope and equality in the face of persecution.
I knew they liked each other, Otto and my mother, but I had no idea how close they were. I was a very difficult teenager. I didn't want to do any housework. I was quite obstinate. I was too miserable. Otto came and, you know, they talked and they helped me a lot. Then when I finished with school, I didn't know what to do with myself. And Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer, which I couldn't really care what I was going to do, but I agreed. So Otto said it would be good if you would go abroad for a year, which I did, to London. Otto came to visit me quite a lot and he kept an eye on me. So he already took the part a bit of a sort of stepfather.
Otto and Elfrida grew closer and closer over time and would marry in 1953. Eva received the news whilst living in London.
He said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love, and they were married for 27 years, so longer than they were married to their first spouses.
Otto had already decided that the Diary of Anne Frank must be published.
He showed it to a few people and gauged their opinions. And then a professor called Jan Romein from the University of Amsterdam read it. And he published an article in the newspaper Het Parool saying that everybody should read this diary.
It was this article that led to the first publication on June 25, 1947.
A third of the diary was actually taken out, removed for two reasons. First of all, Otto wanted to preserve the memory of his late wife and the others in hiding from some of the not quite nice things Anne said about them. But also, the publishing company itself deemed some of the things that Anne wrote about as unsuitable.
When the diary was first published, it had not such a great impact. It was very much a book like many other books that dealt with the occupation of the Netherlands.
When the Dutch book came out, he gave it to everybody who had known Anne. He was very, very generous, of course, with it. He wanted everybody to read it.
And it was published in a time that people were focused on the future. They wanted to forget about what happened here between 1940 and 1945. They had suffered a lot, and people wanted to, to forget about it.
In Europe, people didn't really want to talk about what had happened, about Auschwitz or anything like that. But of course, the diary is not really about this.
So only after the mid-50s, the diary became a great success.
It came out then in 1952 in America. Great difficulty finding an American publisher as well, because people said, well, who is interested in a diary of a young girl?
The publisher who picked it up in America was Doubleday. They had taken a risk as no one really knew whether there would be any interest in it. It took an article by the novelist Meyer Levine to really popularize the book.
Meyer Levine became a friend of Otto and who loved the diary. He wrote a big article in the New York Times, how wonderful it was, and it became an immediate bestseller in America.
The stage play was dramatized by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett and opened in the Court Theatre on Broadway on October 5th, 1955. Anne was played by Susan Strasberg. The production grew and grew in popularity, which was helped in part by the attendance of many Hollywood stars of the time. Ava witnessed its instant success.
The play was a great success in New York first, and in London, then it was translated, was in Germany. Then a film was being made.
The film was released in 1959 to great critical and commercial acclaim. It was directed by George Stevens, and the screenplay was written also by Goodrich and Hackett. The lead of Anne Frank was played by Millie Perkins. However, it was Shelley Winters who won an Academy Award for her portrayal of August van Pels. The world wanted to know more about Anne Frank, and Otto was eager to tell her story and continue to spread her philosophy.
Many Americans came to Amsterdam and always knocked on the door of the house and wanted to see where Anne had been hiding.
It was considered a great idea to think about preserving that hiding place, but not as a museum. Otto's vision was to see Anne's legacy as one of bringing people together.
The foundation goes back to 1957. In order to purchase the house and to open it to the public, so it took 3 years to prepare it.
What he did invest his time and energy bringing together people from around the world for international student conferences.
The Anne Frank House was first a study group for young people. People from all over the world came together and they had conferences and to talk about what they can do to change the world.
The basic feature of this house is its emptiness, which was the deliberate decision of Otto Frank that this place should remain empty. It represents the absence of Anne Frank.
The success of the play, the film, and the opening of the house fueled the proliferation of readers of the original diary.
As people were getting to read the diary, particularly youngsters, they related so much to Anne, and they started writing to Mr. Frank. They saw him in the diary as a very caring person.
Having known Otto for 27 years, I can see, you know, he was really a humanitarian, and Anne, being 2 years cooped up with him, helped her a lot to become who she was.
The point of entry when you read the diary is usually your own life. When I'm inspired by Anne Frank, it's not because my life is similar to hers in any respect, and that goes for actually everyone. So it's about a book that was able to inspire people, although their lives are completely different from her life.
Through her, of course, the world is learning about what has happened, and that is, of course, very, very important.
We have her diary as a kind of silent messenger of someone who is not there anymore, and who's not there anymore because of what has been done to her.
So we have to explain to young people how dangerous it is if we are prejudiced against also human beings.
In preserving the memory of his daughter and also the act of persecution inflicted on her, Otto, through single-minded determination, managed to elevate Anne Frank from a young, talented writer, the victim of a terrible chain of events, to become not just a face, but the symbol of the Holocaust. She has also become a figure of acceptance, forgiveness, and equality. Universal themes which all human beings can relate to. Her thoughts evolved into Otto's philosophy, which today is still maintained through the Anne Frank Foundation and the Anne Frank House, reaching out to millions across the world. Behind the global popularity of her story is the diary of a young girl, an individual with her own aspirations and ideas, who happened to be caught in extraordinarily tragic circumstances.